And we are live. Hello and welcome to all the Hillians out there. I'm Joe, and today with me is not my brother, but the fount of wisdom, Nayru. How
Oh,
are you,
thank you very
Nayru?
much. I'm doing pretty well today. How are you doing?
I'm pretty good. It's not, I don't normally have one of the three golden gods here with me, so it's good to have you. And I've got a lot of questions for one of the creators of the Triforce.
Well, I hope I live up to the name.
Well, I think you will. I've seen some of your videos; they're pretty good. Um, so uh, I'm gonna kind of start this in an almost bland way and pass the ball over to you and
Mhm.
ask you, how is it you came to Zelda in the first place? Was Ocarina of Time your first game?
So kind of and kind of not. My first actual time encountering Legend of Zelda would have actually been A Link to the Past when I was probably 7 or 8 years old.
Mm-hmm.
My cousin had a Super Nintendo, and so I was visiting him. And I, of course, wanted to play the Super Nintendo because we didn't have one at home. We just had a Sega Genesis. So I hopped on there, and the game I was playing was A Link to the Past, and it was the first time I had ever played an adventure game like that. So a lot of it kind of went over my head, but it always kind of stuck with me. That was the one and only time I ever got to play it, but it kind of stuck with me. And then a couple years later, when I was maybe 11 or 12 years old, for Christmas, my mom got me like a secondhand Nintendo 64 with a whole bunch of games, and Ocarina of Time was one of them. And when I was looking through this big pile of games, I recognized the guy in the little green hat on the manual looked a lot like the guy in the hat from that other game I played, and the logos looked really similar. So that was the first game I threw in, and I was just hooked from there. I think I played Ocarina of Time uh, well over 40 times. I actually, uh, we used to have, I used to live in a log cabin, and we all we had was the N64 and then some older consoles. So I didn't have many games to play. So I just replayed the ones I liked over and over again. And every
Wait,
time, what's that?
you lived in a log cabin as well? I
I
lived in
did,
one
yeah.
as a kid.
Oh, there you go. That's funny. But
Yeah.
yeah, the reason that it being a log cabin is important is because every time I would beat the game, I'd walk over and I'd put a little scratch on my wall to make like a tally. And I think
Oh
when
God,
we moved out of that house, I think I was at like 35 or 36 times having beaten the game.
that's
So
incredible.
yeah,
That
so it wasn't my first. Technically, my first was Link to the Past, but it was definitely the one that hooked me.
you were obviously a better gamer than I was as a kid. I never made it very far in Ocarina of Time as a kid.
Took me a good while to get through it, and to beat Twin Rova in particular.
Mm.
Um, I had to get my older cousin to do it until I was maybe 12 or 13 is when I could finally beat that boss on my own. Um, so it definitely took a while for me to be able to beat the game entirely on my own. So don't feel too bad.
Well, I don't. I've come to accept that I'm not a great gamer. The only games I can really kind of do well in are like Kingdom Hearts and the odd Suikoden game here and there. Mostly, I'm garbage. But you know what? At this point in my life, I play video games for a social reason or to just have fun. Um, and but at the same time, I admire those like you or my brother who could conquer such a game. And well, I made it all the way to the castle of Ganon a few years ago, like 5 6 years ago, and then I think my data got deleted or something. I must there something must it was probably because of a storm or something. But as to Ocarina, why is it your favorite?
So when it comes to my favorite Zelda game, it's actually a bit of a tie between Ocarina of Time and Wind Waker.
Hmm.
I sort of enjoy Wind Waker a little bit more, but I think that Ocarina of Time is a better game. Because to me, I can sort of separate like objective quality from personal taste.
Same.
Um, So I definitely think, even if I enjoy Wind Waker a tiny bit more, just for aesthetic reasons and atmospheric reasons, I definitely think that Ocarina of Time is the best Zelda game. And the reason that I think that it's the best Zelda game is because I think that it is the, how do you say, it is the perfect distillation of the Zelda formula, to the degree that it has no bloat issues, because I find Twilight Princess, fans of mine will not be surprised to hear me say this. I find Twilight Princess to be quite a cumbersome game sometimes. It's sort of, to me, Twilight Princess is the Zelda formula to an excess. Whereas something like maybe Majora's Mask or Wind Waker is the Zelda formula maybe a little too bare bones for me, in terms of, only having 4 to 5 dungeons and not much else to do. Whereas I think Ocarina of Time, number one, it's impressive because it is it was their first time translating this formula to 3D, right? And it was
Yeah.
them sort of formulating it into what we know nowadays. Um, However, at the same time, uh, despite being their first time out, it's also, I think, their most successful example of it, because you have, um, you know, just about 10 dungeons, depending on which mini dungeons you count as real dungeons or not. And I don't think there's a single bad dungeon in the entire game, which I don't think is true of any other Legend of Zelda game. I think every other Legend of Zelda game has at least one bad dungeon, except for Ocarina of Time.
Well, what about the
Um,
water temple?
Oh, I actually love the water temple. I know it's
I actually
the
didn't find it all that unbearable. I thought the shadow dungeon, I think it um, was far worse. But that's just me.
oh, I have an impassioned defense of the Shadow Temple that I'll give you in a bit here. But
Okay, go ahead.
for the water temple, I think it's just complicated, and because most people played the game when they were kids, and that temple really stumped them, it sort of rests as an evil beast in their mind. But I think if you go back to it as an adult, there's one key in particular which stumps people every time, which is the key underneath the main level in the center column room. And I forget that key every time too, so I can understand why people get so frustrated, because they're just running around looking for that key like a headless chicken, and then you end up looking up a walkthrough and then kicking yourself. So I understand why people get frustrated, but I think the water temple is awesome. I mean, Dark Link is like the coolest mini boss of all time, right? And the way they build up to him in the water temple, and they have him in that uh, reflective room, all in its own, is extremely epic. So the boss of the water temple is not so good. I'll admit that, but overall, I think the water temple is pretty great. And the my defense of the shadow temple. Um, Most people, especially if you look up, I think the YouTube series is called Boss Keys, where it's basically just like uh, rating all the different dungeons by their mechanical depth. And if you're considering the mechanical depth of a dungeon to be the judging factor of it, then yeah, the Shadow Temple is absolutely not a very good dungeon. But I also don't think that was the point of it. I think that the Shadow Temple was not meant to be hard. It was meant to be a haunted house. Like, it was meant to just be something where you go from room to room to room, and each new room shows you something interesting or scary or horrifying, and then you get past it and go into the next room, which is something I think we saw repeated in Skyward Sword with the Ancient Cistern, where it's the exact same thing. There's no mechanical depth to it really at all.
Yeah.
It's just like a roller coaster ride. You're just there for the fun experience, and at the end, it might be not be the most complicated dungeon, but from both a lore perspective and memorability, the Shadow Temple is probably the most talked about dungeon next to the Water Temple.
I have to admit, what I do like is the horror element. That's what I love about Majora's Mask. Um, I never made it very far, but I've seen my oldest brother just play through all the Zelda games over and over again growing up. So, or most of them. And Majora's Mask, I just remember being very impressed and pleased with the horror element because I'm a horror junkie. So I'm glad you mentioned Majora's Mask because I geek out every time I hear it. And I just wish we got that mask to come back in a later game so that, um, well, spoiler for tomorrow's Zelda video for my channel. I'm planning to make a reference to how they should have stuck the Majora's Mask onto Ganon or something. I know that'd be pretty weird, but I think that'd be pretty cool.
Yeah, that would be a definitely interesting thing. One thing I always have to sort of relay to people and remind people when they're sort of theorizing about the next Zelda games, and I tried to do it with this game too, is that um, the Zelda team is very picky and careful about bringing people back. There are certain characters that you can expect to see in every Zelda game, like Link and Zelda, Ganondorf in most of them.
And Ganon.
Minor characters, yeah, and Ganon. Minor characters like Beetle and Tingle, but there was a big push for Demise and Girahim to return in this game, and people wanted like Astor from Age of Calamity to return and stuff like that. And it was like none of that stuff really stood a chance of happening
Yeah.
any further than just a reference. Because
Yeah.
as much as I would love to see Majora back, that's just not really how the Zelda team operates. They like to either just use Ganon or introduce somebody new.
Yeah. I think that for one thing, now on the one hand, when it comes to Ganon, I've developed a bit of Ganon fatigue. I know that's sacrilegious to some Zelda fans. But on the other hand, he is a staple of the series. And if anything, to an extent, with a lot of the games, they have done a good job when it comes to bringing him back in a lot of them. So I'm of two minds regarding Ganon. As to Zelda and Link, well, obviously you have to have them in almost every game because, well, it's kind of about them.
Yeah.
But getting back to Ocarina of Time, the story, it follows slightly different beats from Link to the Past. Well, Link to the Past was very simple and just simply had Link being tasked by his uncle and Zelda with rescuing first Zelda, then rescuing the kingdom. And then, you just have to go try to save the seven maidens, I think it is, or so, and then save Hyrule from Ganon. But the thing is, they never, while that's probably my favorite game just for the simplicity of it, well, it and Hyrule Warriors, but that's its own can of worms. But with Ocarina of Time, they really went, they were really trying to fill out some of the lore, because A Link to the Past references a imprisoning war that saw, sages sealing away the thief, that is to say Ganondorf, for the theft of the Triforce and whatnot, which, in Ocarina of Time, we're getting to see what those actual events. And it's hard to, I remember at the time, now I was young when Ocarina came out, and I remember at the time that it was a big deal. Like, a lot of people were really excited that they were fleshing this detail out, like this lore. And it's hard to convey to a lot of younger people that just how big Ocarina of Time was. It was graphically the first 3D Zelda. It was, it wasn't just the graphics; it was the story and the events that it covers that were a big deal, and it really, it really did kind of revolutionize Zelda, even as it took a lot of the ideas from A Link to the Past and put them on steroids, I guess. In that, you have the light world, dark world in A Link to the Past, and Ocarina has the child Link and adult Link you have to jump between at times. And of course, Ocarina introduced a larger cast. It's interesting that characters like Impa have made and Rudo have returned for games like Hyrule Warriors and whatnot, and have retained such lasting popularity, though they were just background characters to Link and Zelda in that game. Which all I'm going to say is that speaks to the um, impact the game had. But as for the story, it's interesting that it's, I think, one of the only Zelda games where you don't, like, Link does not really have any relatives and is more of an outsider in his village. Now, I know a lot of the different games went with different ideas, and he is occasionally portrayed as a bit of an outsider, but what I mean is he's an orphan in the purest sense here, because like in Link to the Past, he has his uncle. In Twilight Princess, he's got his neighbors and whatnot who do care about him. Skyward Sword, he at least has, like Zelda's family and whatnot, and he does have some neighbors. But in Ocarina of Time, he only has the Great Deku Tree and Saria, and that's pretty much it. I don't know what you think of that side of the character in the game.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I've always really appreciated about Ocarina of Time is that the hero of time, like the incarnation that we get for Ocarina of Time, going into Majora's Mask and then appearing as the hero's shade in Twilight Princess. Um, he without a doubt is easily the most tragic incarnation of Link.
Mm.
Um, and it's there right from the beginning, just like you said, where his mother dies, dropping him off at uh,
Roots
the the
of the Great
safety
Deku
of the what's that?
I said the roots of the Great Deku Tree. You can't really say feet.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. She dies, dropping Link off as a baby at the roots of the Great Deku Tree, and then he lives his whole life sort of being othered because he doesn't get a fairy, and he only really like. It seems like the other Kokiri are fond of him, but aren't particularly. Um,
They don't know he's
they're
not one of them.
Yeah, exactly. They're fond of him, but there's always a little bit of distance there, except for Saria, who
Mm.
is his truest friend. And then as a child, he's forced out of the home that he knows and is forced to go on a quest that he's not ready for, which is why
Yeah,
he fails at the end of it, right? And that's not something that most Link incarnations have to deal with to quite the same degree is going through failure. Like I think just what every Link does have one moment in their hero's quest where they do fail, but none of them fail quite to the degree that the hero of time does, where he dooms Hyrule by letting Ganondorf into the sacred realm, right? And then he has to atone for that, and his role he plays as an adult in atoning for his failure is basically that he doesn't really get a happy ending no matter how you slice it, because there's three timelines. In one of the timelines he dies, in another timeline he abandons it and the entire place gets flooded, and then in a third timeline he goes and he gets sent back to his childhood and has to undergo the hell that is Majora's Mask, and then in the future survives as the hero's shade, talking about how he's unfulfilled because he never got to be acknowledged as a hero and he never got to pass on his skills and stuff like that. So the hero of time is
yeah. I
to this
never
day.
thought of it as.
Sorry, you can go.
Oh, you no, finish with your thought.
Oh, I was just going to say, to this day, I think that the hero of time is still um, the most tragic incarnation of Link, and it's really impressive that they were able to tell that kind of story on an N64 game.
I never thought of his story has been defined by failure in a way, but it does make sense. Like there is, like yeah, it's clear. There's the failure with Ganon entering the sacred realm, but after that, now that I think about it, it kind of is marked in a way by failure and tragedy, and yeah, I do see it now. And well, yeah, as to refer to Saria, she was his truest friend, and I kind of think of her as almost his maternal figure. And it the scene when on the bridge kind of reminds me of Anakin and Shmi's separation in episode one. So I always found that scene a little tragic in a way. And you could see the same kind of heartbreak that's haunting Link, except Link makes, I would argue, much better choices than Anakin later in life because uh, I don't think anyone can say Anakin made some good decisions
Link did a
eventually
lot
because
less. Link did a lot less youngling slaughtering.
yeah, he actually came to the rescue for the Kokiri and pulled through for them. But it's interesting that while this might sound weird, but they kind of failed him in a way by keeping their distance from him. He really does pull through for them and rescues them and whatnot. That part I really like. It kind of comes full circle in a way with the Kokiri. As to the Great Deku Tree, I like to argue that in a way the Great Deku Tree had a closer bond to Link in some ways than he did some of the Kokiri because of the fact that Link didn't have a fairy to an extent. So yeah, the Great Deku Tree kind of looking out more for him. But I guess that's just my perception rather than the reality. But you do get a strong sense that there's a fondness on Navy, on Saria and Deku Tree's parts towards Link, who is an orphan and does have to rise to the occasion, go on the hero's journey. But it's kind of like you said, it's almost a doomed affair. And now that I think about it, I guess there might be some similarities between Link, the hero of time, and maybe Frodo from Lord of the Rings. It's a doomed venture. Frodo ultimately fails. And for his failure, he has to go west and pretty much to die on Tal Eressëa, I think it is. So they're punished for their failure in a way. And that's where it is fairly tragic with them. And like I also have to admit that I do want to ask you like what if you've read the Zelda manga of A Link to the Past.
I think I have. To be truthful, I'm a little hit or miss on the manga. I like some of it. I don't like quite a lot of
Same.
it. I find that it plays it can play pretty fast and loose with established ideas in ways that I just really don't enjoy. I remember the Link to the Past one being pretty enjoyable. I do
Same.
not like the Majora's Mask one. I vehemently dislike the Majora's Mask one.
I haven't read that one. Um, but A Link to the Ocarina, I was going to say, I don't like some of the dynamics between Zelda and Link in there because Link just he's um, he's so into Zelda, but it doesn't make any sense because he doesn't even know her to an extent.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, Malon's turned into a bit of a creepy weirdo. Um, but the part I did like was Volvagia in there. I actually think that the manga kind of did Volvagia better than the game did, where this was essentially Link's pet, and then Ganon kind of possessed Volvagia, maybe not knowing of the bond. And this is one of the greater tragedies of the game, and I thought that was one of the moments in the manga where it was fairly it set a tone for Ocarina.
Yeah, I feel for the Volvagia, change in the manga. I feel torn on it. Like I do. I found the relationship between Volvagia and Link to be compelling, and obviously it was really sad to watch Link have to more or less put his dog down. But that being said, I
Yeah,
also don't love the change because I find it
lore.
really meaningful for Volvagia to be an ancient threat that used to terrorize the Goron, because I think that gives a lot of impetus to Ganondorf, both to show how evil he is, but also how intelligent he is. That he is able to sort of do his research, learn about this ancient dragon that used to terrorize the Goron, and then specifically bring it back to life to terrorize them some more, uh, which I think shows a pretty deft hand on his end. So
Yep.
I like the change and I don't like the change.
I like it for the narrative purposes, but on the other hand, like you said, with the lore and whatnot, I just found it. Oh, come on, what about the lore? You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
'cause- so I'm a little torn on it as well. Um, that said, when it comes to when it comes to the overall uh, other characters like Impa, Rudo, Zelda, and whatnot, which one was your favorite?
My favorite side character in Ocarina of Time, you mean?
Yeah,
So I would definitely have to say that my favorite character is Naburu. I find Naburu really
the
fascinating
Baru.
because nowadays the Gerudo are just definitively good guys, right?
Yeah,
But back then, they were still villains in almost every game they appeared in. So you have this one sage who is just definitively opposing Ganondorf, um, and she suffers for it. She gets kidnapped and brainwashed, and Link has to beat the brainwashing out of her pretty much. Um,
he has to
so
do
I
that
found,
Robin meme thing of slapping it out of her.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So I find her pretty compelling. But I also really like uh, the sort of, how do you say, I like the development of Mido in the Lost Woods. I'm a big fan of character growth, and I really appreciate that when you go
Yeah,
back and visit him as an adult, he clearly regrets treating Link so poorly.
yeah, I
Has
love that.
Yeah, he's clearly stewed on his action for 7 years and doesn't feel great about it anymore. So
Yeah,
uh, I would say those two are probably my favorite characters.
Noboru. Honestly, I remember really liking her as a kid, and the Gerudo are something that I like the transition from semi-villain, semi-anti-villain type characters towards anti-heroic, towards now kind of heroic of sorts. And I like the development of them from kind of barbarians to slash tribal people to a pretty advanced civilization in Breath of the Wild and whatnot. That I thought was. Um, I, I know a lot of people won't approve of this, but I'm kind of met towards Breath of the Wild, but I really love what they did with the Gerudos. I think that was the best development for the Gerudos that I've ever seen in any Zelda game,
Yeah, I
since
agree.
Nabooru, of course. Like what they did with the Gerudos, I think, like it just there's so much detail, there's so much work put in. That's where I real it. Even if I've got mixed feelings about some elements of the games, it does like knowing that they can do something like that gives me hope for the next game. So that I see it as well. You got to give the next one a chance because like if they could get that much right, maybe they could get more right in the next iteration. I know that's a bit. I don't know if that's naive or optimistic, but it's just the thing with Zelda is it's either hit or miss with a lot of games, but when they hit, they knock it out of the ballpark. And nowhere is that truer than with Ocarina of Time to an extent. And in the 90s, we truly were blessed in a way because I'm just saying, from my perspective, Link to the Past was a home run. Then you had Ocarina. Then you had Majora. You had a bunch of home runs, one after the other. But okay, so you ended up discussing the Water Temple and the Shadow Temple. Now your favorite characters. Um, Now, for me, I ended up as a kid. I was more struck by the meeting with Zelda in the dungeon in A Link to the Past, but uh, so that I didn't get the full impact of meeting Zelda in that garden. But and this is a conversation I've had with some other Zelda fans in real life. And um, what was like? Did that scene with meeting Zelda in the garden have that big an impact on you?
Yeah, it definitely did. One of the things that I think Ocarina of Time to this day doesn't get enough credit for. It's one of the few ways, like Ocarina of Time is obviously a beloved game, right? And
Yeah.
it very much gets the accolades it deserves.
Mm.
But I think one of the few ways that Ocarina of Time is actually a little bit underrated is just in how people I don't think appreciate um, how good the how do you how good the cut not the cut scenes but how good the how good looking the storytelling is in the game visually.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is if you take Ocarina of Time and you compare it to a game that came out a year later in Metal Gear Solid, and you take any random cutscene from those two games. Ocarina of Time, I love Metal Gear Solid. It's my second favorite game series, but Ocarina of Time blows Metal Gear Solid clean out of the water, right? Uh, we're talking about Metal Gear Solid despite being um, a contemporary game having no facial animation to speak of. So all of their storytelling needs to be done through words, which is part of the reason why that game is so text dense and why the cutscenes are so long. Is because they can't do subtlety. Most games at that point couldn't do subtlety or anything sort of subtextual at that point. But then you have Ocarina of Time, and it's like even if we go back to that scene with Saria where we see her sort of sadly and longingly looking at Link as he's slowly and awkwardly backing away. There was not a single word said in that entire back half of the scene, but we still understood exactly what these characters were feeling, which is just mind blowing for gaming at that time, right? Like there's almost no other contemporary games that are capable of that kind of thing. And that's part of what made the scene with Zelda so special to me. Is even when I replayed the game a couple months ago for the 60 something time or whatever it is, when I got to the Zelda's courtyard scene, I was just blown away at how well her face is animated. You know, like she has like 6 or 7 different emotions that she cycles through throughout the entire conversation. And as a kid, I had never encountered anything like that at all. And I feel like that particular angle was really fully on display in the conversation with Zelda, where if you tell her something she wants to hear, she gets really happy expression, and if you tell her something she doesn't want to hear, or she's talking about something sad, she gets really sad. And then for it to move on to the explanation of the creation myth, which was unlike anything I had ever experienced in gaming up to that point. Like I had never experienced a cutscene of that magnitude before.
The creation
Um,
is mind blowing in Ocarina of Time. I'm just saying, I remember it being. I watched it a while back, and it's still mind blowing to me.
yeah, it's still really good. It still looks great. So yeah, the meeting with Zelda, Ocarina of Time Zelda is not my favorite incarnation by a long shot. It's pretty middling for me. But the meeting scene with her in particular was pretty special, and I think it was also special because you had to work for it. Like you heard about Princess Zelda, but you didn't actually meet her until you got entirely through a full temple, and then you sneak in to see her, and then finally you get to meet her.
Mm.
Um, so I definitely agree that the meeting with Princess Zelda was pretty special.
Okay. Now, I'll just be honest. I now I have a better idea. Like I said, I for me, I remember a lot of people getting mad or impatient with me when I'd say I don't fully get why this was such a like one of your top 25 or whatever memorable moments in gaming history. Like I do understand what the emotional part, like the emotions on her face and whatnot. I do agree there. However, for me, I guess I always found that the finding her in the dungeon where she had been chained and you know was to await execution by Aghanim far more impactful for me. But I was about 2 or 3 years old when I saw that, so that kind of left an impact on me. Whereas Ocarina, it was several years later. But as for Ocarina of Time, what I just find funny is just um, how she tried to tell her dad that Ganon was not such a great guy, and yet her dad remained determined to trust in Ganondorf, which proved to be his undoing in um, at least I think two of the timelines. So, uh, so that part of the story was also pretty funny. How Link and Zelda, who are basically kids, have to take up um, they have to take matters into their own hands to rescue the kingdom from the king's, no offense, but kind of stupidity and Ganondorf's villainy. I don't. Any thoughts on that part?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely correct. And earlier when we were talking about how Ocarina of Time is in at least a part about failure and Link dealing with his own failure, there is no doubt that it was a failure on his end to accidentally let Ganondorf um, into the sacred realm, but it was a failure he had to experience because of wider failure by the society around him, right? Like the king just falling for Ganondorf's machinations at every single turn, and nobody doing anything to um, prevent what was obvious to even children, right?
Yeah,
Uh, and that's a pretty recurring thing with the King of Hyrule is that he's kind of an idiot, and it's
and
the case. It's the case in Breath of the Wild as much as it is in just about every previous game. Um,
yeah.
so,
and
but
it's I think important that Link fails there, as failure is a part of growing up.
mhm.
And uh, well, we've all met with failure after failure. What's that Rocky Balboa line? It's not how hard uh, you hit, but it's how hard you can take a hit and keep getting back up.
Yeah,
And I think that's the case with this game in a way, as Link has to take hit after hit after hit, and yet he has to keep getting back up. And that's something I really do like. I think that that's also true in some other Zelda games, but in Ocarina, it's almost more true than most of the others. And it's very interesting that they were able to tell such a profound story and send it such a profound message back in the N64 era, which is very fascinating, I find. Um, and arguably, this game was a lot shorter than modern games. It didn't have any of the graphical advancements of, say, Skyward Sword, which looks gorgeous, Breath of the Wild, which looks gorgeous, or Twilight Princess, which I think is probably the best looking Zelda game of all times. But Ocarina was able to tell such a incredible story. And what's what I but yeah, it's very funny that children could see through Ganon and say, that guy's bad. Why can't you see it? And you have the king who's unable to see it, and the society at large, which is either unwilling or incapable of seeing it. And it's 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 kind of here where when you look at how far Hyrule sinks in the adult timeline, like just looking at that part of the game, um, I'm reminded of something Robert E. Howard, the writer of Conan the Barbarian, stories from the 20s and 30s, used to believe, and how civilization is temporary, barbarism is inevitable, and that every civilization is in the process of reaching its peak and then declining and destroying itself, and then returning to barbarism, which restores it to its proper values. And then the barbarism is also temporary, as this civilization will slowly but surely return to civilization. I guess you could say. I don't know if that's making any sense, but the idea is, um, uh, like all societies are in a process of rising, declining, and then destruction, and then rebirth in a way, and they're constantly going around in a circle. And there's a lot of historians currently wrestling with this and grappling with this theory. Most are saying no, it can't be true, but there's a hint of panic with them when they talk about it, because if it is true, then this is just temporary. What the era we're currently living in. I'm not trying to get on a soapbox or something, but with Ocarina of Time, you have this high point in civilization just after a war, I think over the succession, the one that I think saw Link's father die, and then you've got a complete backslide into barbarism under Ganondorf. But what Ganondorf's rule also reminds me of real quick is Lion King with Scar. You know what I mean? Like we see the Pride Lands under Mufasa, and we see it under Scar, and you kind of see the same thing with. While this king wasn't very smart, he was the rightful king under traditional archetypal rules and whatnot, I guess. And you see Ganon and how he would run the show, and it's just every man for himself. It's barbarous. There's no real civilization left. He basically just nuked it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, you're. I think you're definitely onto something there. I think that one of the things I really appreciate about Ocarina of Time is that it has, in my opinion, um, with the caveat that again I haven't finished Tears of the Kingdom, so maybe things will be different by the end of it. But in my opinion, it has like easily the smartest and most adept Ganondorf we see in the entire series. Like you look at something like Twilight Princess, and it has a Ganondorf who primarily um, gets to the position he is through sheer power and through the co-option of people who are weaker than him. You have something like Wind Waker, where you have a Ganondorf who is almost sort of down on his luck. His power doesn't really extend that far by the time you put him down. And then you have like Calamity Ganon, who's just a mindless beast, right? But in Ocarina of Time, you have a Ganondorf who is politically savvy.
Mm.
Like you see him trick the king, and you see him go to each of the different races and beat them into submission, not through force but through trickery. By depriving the Gorons of their food until they are willing to agree, by poisoning the deity of the Zora so they have nobody to rely on, by poisoning the father figure of the Kokiri, so their protection is gone and they'll have to turn to him. And then we see it again when he comes to power, and these races are starting to think of rebelling. He doesn't just go out and crush them with the army, because he's a politically savvy enough guy to know that he doesn't need to do that. He can just keep each of these different groups of people busy, by awakening an ancient evil for the Gorons, freezing the Zora so they're not an issue anymore, and letting monsters loose in the force of the Kokiri. So he doesn't have to stretch his powers thin, and he can keep all his powers sort of consolidated. So I really appreciate that they gave us such a politically savvy and active Ganondorf, who you hear about constantly going to all these different places, and almost like Ganondorf had a little adventure of his own before we started playing. Whereas with most Ganondorfs, they just go to their throne room and then send their monsters out and then wait for Link, right?
Yeah.
Um, so that's definitely I appreciate that. But in regards to what you were talking about in terms of civilizations in decline and then rise, I think the really interesting thing is that, like, if you look at Skyward Sword, and then if you look at the game that is furthest in the future, which would probably be Spirit Tracks, you see some pretty significant technological advancement, right? They go from fairly primitive people living in the skies all the way up to having automotives and vehicles and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But then you see Breath of the Wild, which supposedly comes out after all the other games, and you see this massive, massive reversion back to a really base civilization, um, where somehow they went from having these automotives and these locomotives back to, tribes cooking with campfire.
Yeah.
And even within the games themselves, I think you see quite a lot of technological stagnation, um, which I think in part is due because of the fact that in the Zelda timeline they're just constantly getting wiped out every 2 or 3 games and having to start over.
Yeah.
So I definitely think that theory does apply to Zelda pretty well, both in the macro level of the individual games, or the micro level of the individual games, and the macro level of looking at the entire timeline.
And there's also the fact that now, just to add to that theory, I think that there's also the factor that maybe the societies of Hyrule sometimes come to depend too much on the return of the hero. You know what I mean? Like, oh, well, maybe at some point the hero will return and solve our problems. So let's leave it to him. And then they don't solve the problem and it just mushrooms in some cases. Not every, but like maybe this, which, well, all I'm theorizing is to an extent, like you look at, uh, what game was it? You look at, uh, well, you look at the prelude to Wind Waker when Hyrule was flooded. Like basically the people and the king wanted to turn to the goddesses and to essentially the hero, like solve our problem for us. Well, sorry, but you let the problem exacerbate to such a degree, and that is just a total disaster in every way. And but that aside, what when it comes to now, what I find also interesting in Ocarina of Time is that I think it's the only game, one of the only Zelda games, now that I think about it, where you don't power up the Master Sword.
Yeah, that is correct.
Okay. Because for a minute I was like, wait, it has to have happened there because, unless my memory is failing. But I just find that very amusing in how, in like A Link to the Past, which is the next in the Ruin timeline or Fallen Kingdom timeline, I think it is, you have to power up the Master Sword. And you have other games like not Twilight Princess, Tears of the Kingdom recently, which that one you obviously are going to have to because of what happens in the prologue. I can't do spoilers, and I plan to do that in a video tomorrow, but I can't do it here. I don't know how far people have made into Tears of the Kingdom, but the but as to Ganon being a trickster of sorts, going around and screwing everyone over. This is an aspect of the character, yeah, I don't think you see too often, and it was a good a good factor in idea with the character. I just Now, on his end, I wonder what led to his failure to an extent. I wonder if it was maybe victory defeating him in a way. Like, like, oh, well, I've got the Zoras where I want them. I froze their lake. What can they do against me? Or, like, I unleashed Volvagia on the Gorons. What can they do? I've got them right where I want them. If maybe victory kind of made him complacent.
Yeah, and I think it's definitely that, and I think it's also just an intense amount of hubris. I think that Ganondorf likes to be challenged. That's why when he interacts with Link the first time, there's always a smile on his face, and he's always giving off his patented Ganondorf evil laugh. Is because I think that he wants to rule, but he also wants to be challenged. He wants to have that final conflict, which is the reason why in almost every single Zelda game with Ganondorf in it, he meets Link before the actual final battle and spares him. He chooses not to kill him. It happens for sure in Ocarina, and it happens for sure in Wind Waker. I'm pretty sure it happens in Twilight Princess. I can't quite remember. And I think the only game he appears in where, again, I haven't completely finished Tears of the Kingdom, but I think the only game that Ganondorf appears in and he doesn't run into Link and spare him is Four Swords Adventures, and that's because we never actually meet him when he's Ganondorf. By the time we finally catch up to him, he's turned into Ganon. So I think it's very much part of resting on his laurels, taking victory for granted for sure. But also, I think he has that character flaw in him where he needs to prove that he's the best, which is why, even though this one Ganondorf has encountered Link many, many times, sees a boy in green and goes, "Oh, this is obviously the new Link." Like theoretically, when he ran into Link outside of the castle when he was a child in Ocarina of Time, he should have just splatted his head on the concrete, right? Like he should have just killed
Yeah.
Link there and then his plan would succeed. Same with Wind Waker, when he was brought to Ganondorf all feeble. Ganondorf should have just killed him there and then, but he made the conscious choice to let him go because I think that Ganondorf has this intense desire to prove that he is as powerful as he believes he is. And time again chooses to prove it by swearing that this is the time he'll defeat the hero and giving Link a chance to catch up to him in the final battle, which is time and time again, with the exception of the downfall timeline, his downfall.
Yeah. In Downfall, at least in A Link to the Past, he seems more bent on getting rid of the sages. And I don't think he meets with Link before the final battle. And in there seems to be, well, at least in my opinion, it seems more like it's all business. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
He's got
it's kind of tricky with the Link to the Past because it really depends on whether you believe when he refers to Aghanim as his alter ego. It depends on whether you believe that Aghanim is just Ganondorf in disguise, in which case he does run into Link earlier in the story, or if Aghanim is just like a sacrifice to raise him, in which case he doesn't run into him later.
Yeah. But
And
okay, I hadn't thought of it that way. In that regard, I guess that also kind of fits. He still seems pretty intent on those on those maidens and on Zelda, and then just getting rid of them first.
yeah,
So
and
that
they're
he's a bit
also.
more,
Sorry, you go.
I was going to say he seems a bit more nervous about being sealed up again.
Yeah, for sure. What I was going to say is there's also in my mind, there has to be a little bit of a divide between Ganondorf and Ganon, because even though they are the same character, right? The way that Ganondorf acts when he's in his human form and the way that he acts when he's in his bestial form is very different, which is why like I wouldn't expect him to be very politically savvy in The Adventure of Link or Legend of Zelda NES, right? Because he's just a giant raging monster. Um,
But truly, the best middle ground between them is the 1980s Zelda's cartoons Ganon.
yeah, absolutely. Or even better, the CDI Ganon.
Yeah. Sorry, I did a series of reviews on those, and that Ganon just always made me laugh. Like, I could not take him seriously, but at least I laughed. Then again, I couldn't
I
take Link seriously either.
I actually love the voice actor for Ganondorf in the CDI games. I love his deep voice.
Mm, I
It's a
haven't played
shame he had such
CDI.
horrible lines to work with.
Mm.
Don't play them; they're horrible.
All right. But as for Ganondorf, I had to add the last part because I was, trying to. Yeah, I guess what I find interesting is how he does seem to take Link lightly, at least in Ocarina of Time. He doesn't. Now he's playing Link, so to speak, and outsmarting Zelda and Impa and Link at the child point in the game. But then when he meets with Link, when Link's running around countering his plans and gathering together, I guess you could say, a bit of a rebellion against him, Ganon is pretty slow to act. But it's interesting that Ganondorf does try to still maintain the upper. He tries to use more cunning, like you said. I do like that. On the other hand, it might sound harsh, but I find that I know a lot of people like that Zelda's Shike, and I don't mind that. But on the other hand, I find it terribly disappointing how Ganon so easily captures her, and from that point on, she's just like, "Oh, help me, Link." Yeah, well, you're a ninja chick. Help yourself. Can't you slit his throat in his sleep? Like, what do you need Link for? And yet, she's just utterly, you know what I mean? She's just a complete damsel in distress, and it might sound harsh, but I kind of find that, well, I get Malin. I have I got more respect for her. I got more respect for Saria, Maburu, and Impa, and yet you're just going to stand there when you're the best trained person in Hyrule. What are you doing? You have the power of the Triforce of Wisdom, the power of you're essentially from the reincarnation of Hylia, sort of. You're of the royal family, and you have those ninja skills, and you need Link to rescue you. What? And I know that's a weird. I know I'm going to have a lot of fans who are going to mob me here. I'm not trying to start something or be contrarian here. I just naturally am contrarian. But enough about my French heritage. But it's just I find that this Zelda, on the one hand, I find her frustrating. On the other hand, I like that she tries to strategize against Ganondorf early in the game. I like that, like she sends Link back in time, and from her standpoint, I find that a very fascinating decision, and I will kind of defend it. But it's just Zelda, like in the adult part of the game, I find weirdly more frustrating than actually cool or badass as others might. I don't know what your stance on her is.
I can definitely relate to how you feel. I've definitely always felt like it was really weird that Sheik is so seemingly competent throughout the game, um, showing off like a pretty high level of what seems to be training, but then is caught off guard so easily by Ganondorf at the end. I definitely can see where that's being frustrating. Um, to me, I just sort of look at it as she was caught off guard. Like her and Link were having a bit of a moment, so to speak, when she was transferring the light arrows over and revealing herself. And it may just have been a moment where she was maybe letting her
Yeah.
like quite literally letting her hair down, and Ganondorf caught her lacking, so to speak. Um,
Well, no, I
but
that moment I get. It's in the castle itself after she's freed that I just wonder, you
yeah, I
know,
mean, when you're trapped in a prison crystal, I suppose there's only so much you can do.
yeah, there I get it. But like once she's freed, she just, you know what I mean?
Why
She,
didn't she help fight Ganondorf?
or yeah, or help in the escape. She's really needing Link to hold her hand through the whole thing, and that I just find it's just that's where I find her a little frustrating.
Yeah, that's totally fair. I guess she just can't fight in a dress.
Well, she can't she just I don't know, drop a smoke bomb and become Shike again?
That's true. Yeah. Yeah.
And
No. I mean, the lame answer, of course, is just that Nintendo wasn't capable of programming her to fight with you against Ganondorf, right? But from a story point of view, I can definitely understand where that is frustrating. Overall, I think that in my opinion, Ocarina of Time, one of my few criticisms of it, and it's not even really that much of a criticism, but I definitely think that it has a fairly middling Zelda incarnation as far as things go. I definitely prefer most of the other 3D game incarnations. I think she's a little boring in Twilight Princess, but I
I
like her
really like
better in
Princess.
she's just kind of there. She doesn't really do
Oh,
much.
I meant like her sacrifice and whatnot. I thought that was a beautiful moment.
That's fair. That is a pretty good moment. Um,
But okay, so now, so you're feeling. I'm kind of surprised to hear that from an Ocarina of Time fanboy. So uh, this Zelda's fairly middling. Explain.
Yeah, I just look at her in just about every other 3D game, like in Wind Waker. She's with Link for quite a lot of the game, right? And she's out doing things. She even tries to kung fu kick Ganondorf in the head, which obviously doesn't work, but it's the thought that counts, right? And then you have like Skyward Sword Zelda, where she is off on her own adventure for the entire thing.
I
Her
really
and
like
Link
that.
Yeah, her and Link have like a very clearly communicated relationship more than any of the other games. She's very highly intelligent and quite clearly cares a lot. And then even you have Breath of the Wild Zelda, who is very flawed, right? But she is very deeply written, and her inability to help is not from a lack of trying. Like, she tries as hard as she physically can. It's just not something that she can do until the very last moment. Um, so obviously, like the 2D games that come before Ocarina of Time, and most of the ones that come after the Zelda incarnations are they have sometimes 2 to 3 lines in the entire game. So obviously, I like the Ocarina of Time one more than those. But I definitely do find the Ocarina of Time Zelda to be a little bit lame compared to the later ones. Like, I don't think she's a bad character or anything. I
Uh,
just think the others are that
better.
much better.
Oh, okay. I I don't know. Like, I honestly don't know how to judge her. Sorry. The first part, like I'm actually, I think that it was a very daring move to make her a kid in the first part of the game. Her and Link being kids, I thought that was a really interesting part of the game. I still think it's one of the most bold, creative decisions for such a game to undertake. And yet, I think that, like I said, I may get irritated with that last level of Zelda, but on the other hand, it this is a Zelda I am quite familiar with and I quite like deep down. So I'm surprised at such a rating, but I don't really have an argument as you're more familiar with Zelda than I am, obviously. And I think that I think that this Zelda does merit the Triforce of Wisdom. Now, as much as I said that I find it really irritating how she just basically becomes a damsel all of a sudden. On the other hand, thematically, she's well, this is Link's story in a way. He's the warrior archetype, and she's the Lady Fair. He has to kind of rescue, or at least the Queen archetype. He's Gawain, or I mean Gawain. She is kind of the queen, so he has to. He's there at her service, is what I mean. Like, and they're fulfilling a very archetypal, thematic type of story and um, well tale that they're doing. This is inspired by, like I said, medieval literature. All fantasy fiction is, and the thing with Link is here he's just basically the story of Gawain or Percival serving the queen or defending her honor. So in that regard, Zelda not fighting her own battle, so to speak, kind of also makes sense from a thematic point of view. So while I get irritated, I do understand it from another point of view, I guess. And well, on the other hand, um, as to her final choice to send Link back in time, what are your thoughts on that one?
I think that it was the wrong decision, but I think it was an incredibly compassionate thing for her to do.
Mhm.
Um, it ultimately doomed Link to a pretty miserable life, but I don't think she had any way of knowing that was going to happen. I
No,
think if you asked Link what he wanted to do, he would probably say stay, just because he wanted to keep everybody safe. But
yeah,
deep down, he probably would want the chance to relive his childhood. Um, but uh, obviously, there's no way for her to know that it was going to essentially be dooming the timeline. Um,
I have a theory about that, and mine is that I think she might have theorized that sending Link back in time to relive his childhood and stop Ganondorf, I think she was probably running with the logic that it would erase the present timeline.
Interesting.
You know what I mean? Like her notion was this. It's like the idea that I think it's Midnight Trunks from DBZ originally theorized some events shouldn't happen. So let's just go back to an earlier point in the timeline, fix things, and maybe our timeline will disappear. That's not what happens in Dragon Ball Z, and that's not what happens in Zelda. But maybe that's what she was kind of thinking. Like, okay, if I send him earlier in the timeline and we just retrace things, except in a better direction, maybe that'll fix things. And, like, I won't have the memories, but Link will probably be the only one with the memories. But ultimately, it'll be happier. It'll be a better timeline. But that's not what happened. She split the timeline in a way. And, well, not in a way, she did split the timeline. But maybe she didn't know she was kind of creating this paradox, so to speak. I don't know what you think of that theory.
It's definitely interesting. I've never really thought about that. It would seem to be pretty in line with her character, to be that forward thinking. So it definitely seems like it's a sound theory. Um, I definitely don't think it would be any way for her to know that she was splitting the timeline, especially since I don't think Nintendo really knew they were splitting the timeline until about 10 years ago.
Very true.
Um,
I don't think
so,
it's not until like the past, what, 10 years or so that that Nintendo decided that yes, we want a full on uh how should I word it? We're committed to a storyline here. Like, you know what I mean? Like, we're committed to each of them being in the same universe.
yeah,
It's
it was the lead up to the Hyrule Historia where they finally sat down and figured out what game goes where. Although, still, I don't think they're very committed to the timeline. They pretty much immediately abandoned it right after releasing it with Breath of the Wild.
yeah, yeah.
But
Which
that's the Zelda team for you. They care about the lore a lot less than we do.
yeah, I hadn't thought I wasn't gonna word it that way, but yeah, c'est vrai. What I find funny about that is, on the other hand, I think that there's a lot of missed opportunities to an extent because um, this might sound weird, but I struggle with playing video games. I just find that usually I don't have. It might sound weird, but I don't have the attention span for playing solo games anymore. I can play games socially, but I can't play them on my own. I get bored, and I can't even play my favorite games anymore on my own. But movies and novels, I can enjoy. I can read a book for 5 hours and I won't even notice the time. But a part of me kind of wishes they would release Legend of Zelda novels and whatnot. It doesn't just have to be about Link or Zelda, but like, you know what I mean? Expand the lore, um, expand the mythos, like maybe explore what the average commoner thinks over in Hyrule Castle Town. Maybe the average guard, what's his life like? Um, Maybe the Gerudo, how they built up such a beautiful civilization in Breath of the Wild. Like, I know this is kind of weird and uh, bizarre, I guess. And it's not that I want them to make the same mistakes to say the Blizzard team has done with the Warcraft novels, which seem like a confused mess. Not to badmouth Blizzard too much, but a lot of those novels, when I try to get into them, they're just such a confused mess. Not all of them, but some. But then when I look at like Lord of the Rings, Conan, there's a good thing going there, and I just think that maybe, or and even Dragonlance, there's a good thing going there. So maybe Zelda could learn. Nintendo and the Zelda team could maybe learn from that. I don't know what your thoughts are on the idea of a overall Zelda, like expanding the franchise to novels and whatnot.
I think it's a great idea. I don't think it'll ever happen. And if it does happen,
Now,
it'll be treated the same way the manga are. The way I think that the Zelda team, obviously, my name isn't Aonuma, so I don't know what is in the man's mind, or Fujibayashi now, but
or Miyamoto.
or Miyamoto back in the day, yeah. But the way it seems to be is that the Zelda team only really cares about the lore in as much as it relates to the current Zelda game they are making now.
Yeah, I noticed
And
that.
they completely disregard it in other ways, right? Like a really good example of it, relating to Tears of the Kingdom, is this is not a spoiler; it's right from the trailer. But in the game, they refer to the imprisoning war, and the moment that happened, everyone got so excited. They're like, oh man, is this relating to the imprisoning war we've heard about in previous games?" No, it's just it's referring to its own in-universe imprisoning war, completely separate from the old games, right? And that really upset a lot of people. But I think that's just a perfect example of how the Zelda team only really cares about lore in as much as it affects the current game they're working on. And because of that, things like the manga, things like the Hyrule Historia and the Hyrule Encyclopedia all have lore bits in it that I'm sure the Zelda team just completely disregards. So if we were to get novelizations or something like that, I think it would very much be the case where a novel would write something that would get immediately overwritten by a future game and would just lead to everybody getting even more confused and complicated, because
Yeah,
it it would be like trying to um,
that's
mesh the expanded Star Wars universe stuff with the current Disney universe. Like
it's impossible.
the yeah, the people making the games would just not care about all of the supplementary material, and they just make what they want to make, which is beautiful. It's frustrating for the fans, but there's also a certain beauty to it.
There's something James Rolfe, AVGN, once said. It's that the Zelda timeline and issue here with the lore and whatnot is an unsolvable puzzle. It's a mess in a way, and it's one that the fans are determined to solve, but the creators, I think he said something like, they're not at all interested. Like they're not really delving too deep into it. But at the same time,
Absolutely.
we have seen them prove themselves capable of really doing a great job when they put their minds to lore for the current
Yep.
game. They can do
Yeah.
some great work with it. Real quick, we have a chat. Guten Abend. I hope I pronounced that right. My German is pretty much non-existent. The second time I catch you with a Zelda stream. Yeah, thank you, Mark Scheiber, for that. And I still haven't played more than the Game Boy game way too long ago. I think it's one of the season games he's referring to.
Could be Link's Awakening as well. Either way, those are all excellent games. So whichever one you played, I'm sure it was a banger.
I haven't touched any of them on Game Boy, which, well, I beat Link to the Past on 3DS about a year and a half ago, and that was fun. And but Ocarina of Time, um, as to Zelda, just to get back to her decision, um, it's interesting that it was committed with such good intent, and yet it just resulted in such a mess in the timeline and for Link. And
Yeah, I think that's the entire story of Ocarina of Time is good intentions gone wrong.
yeah, now just to expand on it a little, with now I'll just comment on the fact that in A Link to the Past, because it takes place several generations, down the road, um, and the Hyrule Castle has obviously been rebuilt and has a lot of hidden tunnels. One thing I ended up commenting on in my Hyrule in Focus videos, I'm not trying to constantly shout out my own channel. It's just um, it pertains here is that Zelda, I think, oversaw the she had to oversee the rebuilding of Hyrule in the adult timeline and fallen timeline to some extent. And I wonder, like, I think we get to see just what kind of ruler she kind of proved herself to be. And this might sound controversial, I don't know, but most Zelda games, I don't think she ends up claiming the crown. But Ocarina of Time Zelda, clearly she's the last of the royal lineage. So we have here a succession crisis for Hyrule. And I'm just saying, they are in a crisis because of Ganondorf. Um, well, when you tend to wreck the kingdom and try to tear it apart bit by bit, it does create a bit of a mess. But I think what's remarkable, at least I tend to look at Fallen timeline as, like you got her and maybe her son who ended up rebuilding Hyrule Castle and Hyrule. And I honestly think that given all the hidden passages and Link to the Past and whatnot, this hints at her wanting an escape route. You know what I mean? Like she's trying to learn from the lessons that her dad unwittingly taught her. Like you can never have enough escape routes. I don't know what you think of that notion.
Yeah, I think you're totally right.
This Zelda is probably one of the smarter ones, is my point. Like not I'm not trying to smack talk the others. I just mean she's very clearly a very intelligent Zelda. She's thinking a lot of steps down the road and how to avoid kind of the mistakes of daddy, but also how to get out of danger if Ganon comes back or something.
Yeah, and I think part of that is can be attributed to the fact that she had to spend 7 years on the run from him, right? So
Yeah, she
I
became a
think
survivor.
yeah, exactly. She's a survivor, and I think her mind became very escape oriented and backup plan focused,
Hmm.
um, and that sort of thing. Um,
So she
and
became Batman.
what's that, sorry?
She became Batman.
Yeah, exactly. Zelda Batman. And I think it's also notable that it seems like, as you said, compared to most other Zeldas, except for maybe Twilight Princess Zelda, she is the most active from a perception, even if it's mostly after the game is over. Whereas in Twilight Princess, we actually do see Queen Zelda giving commands on her own, right?
Yeah,
Um, Whereas
I
with
think
Ocarina
also
of
the
Time, what's that? Sorry.
oh no, continue your thought.
Oh, I was just gonna say with Ocarina of Time, it is mostly after the game, but we do see a lot of implications that she is taking control of things after Link leaves.
Yeah, and I only say mention the Fallen timeline. Only I know that like officially Link dies there and whatnot. But Ganon is sealed away, and Zelda's left to pick up the pieces. And
Mhm.
given that we have the royal family still around in A Link to the Past, it means she did find herself a new guy, and she did end up rebuilding. And like I always suspected that her and maybe her son were like she passed down the legacy of you got to rebuild and you got to have those escape routes ready. And because the Zelda and A Link to the Past is familiar with all the escape routes out of the castle, so that means that like this was passed down in the family from generation to generation.
Yeah.
That you got to be ready to escape. But on the other hand, oh, go.
Oh, I was just gonna say, and another thing that I think is worth sort of pointing out is that the decline timeline is sort of seems to be the timeline that is most abandoned by the gods. Like uh, you
Mhm.
see influence from the gods and from Hylia in both of the other timelines. You see it via the ending of Twilight Princess, and you see it in Wind Waker when they flood the entire place. But in the Decline timeline, the gods are almost nowhere to be found. They're only really mentioned here and there. And even then, it's quite scant. With the decline timeline, it really seems like Hyrule is just left alone. The kingdom of Hyrule is left alone to solve its own problems, um, and it seems like that's part of why the in every game we seem to see the kingdom in something of a state of disarray and decline, is because they really are just left to solve their problems on their own now, which in that case, it would really make sense for Ocarina of Time Zelda to be the first one to institute that sort of self reliance that would come to define the decline timeline, because she was pretty self reliant, with the exception of getting captured at the end.
Yeah, and she probably did pass that down in the family, saying, you got to be self reliant and don't forget your duty to your people, because these were two traits that her dad didn't have. And on the other hand, looking at adult timeline, there again, and eventually makes a resurgence because Twilight Princess, as you mentioned. And what's interesting is that I think there's only maybe two or three Zeldas who end up being queens. Like when I say queens, I mean Queen Helena, not queen consort, in some capacity. Um, and that I think is really really interesting with how, yeah, like I said, I think that's an interesting aspect of Ocarina of Time. That said, I wonder. I know this is weird, but I wonder what happened to Zelda after A Link to the Past uh, in the child timeline. Oh, Nayru's mic is muted for the moment.
Sorry, I just had background noise going on, so I was muting when I wasn't talking. A Link to the Past is an interesting one, because yeah, we do sort of see her captured as a princess. They're never quite definitive on her age, there are they?
No, her and Link are probably young adults, and all we see of the Ocarina of Time Zelda is just the influence she wielded across the centuries.
Yeah,
But refounding the dynasty and whatnot, and the nation. But over in the child timeline, what I find, what I kind of wonder is what, like, we know what became of the hero of time, but what became of Zelda in that timeline? I wonder.
yeah, it's interesting. Well, in the child timeline, in Majora's Mask, we see a little bit of Princess Zelda interacting with Link after he leaves. We see a cutscene of her teaching him an ocarina of a song on the ocarina, and it is quite definitively framed as being after he goes back in time and rats Ganondorf out.
Yeah,
Um, and we also see
we should have
uh,
seen a scene right there. Sorry for interrupting. We should have seen a scene of Gandalf going, "I would have gotten away with it if it wasn't for you dumb kids and your
yeah,
dumb family."
absolutely. And you also see reference to the fact that they seem to have become really good friends in the child timeline as well. So
Yeah.
when Link does go back in time and goes to find Princess Zelda, it seems they forge a connection very quickly and very closely, similar to the one they have, and probably even more advanced than the one they have in Ocarina of Time, because in the child timeline, the threats dealt with immediately and they're able to spend more time in peace with one another. Um, but Link
Mhm.
seems to leave for Termina not very long after Ocarina of Time. So um, we get to see a little bit of what she gets up to after Ocarina of Time, but not really that much. And
Yeah.
it is pretty interesting. Like when we get to Twilight Princess, which is a ways after Ocarina of Time, but Ocarina of Time is still within living memory because we see Ganondorf's execution, right? Um,
Mhm.
it seems like before Ganondorf comes back, Hyrule is thriving. And since it seems like it's only one or two rulerships away from Ocarina of Time, it seems like she left the kingdom off in pretty good hands, and like she left it better
Well,
than she found it, kind of thing.
I, now in child timeline, I wonder if she really was the heir.
I would assume so because I'm pretty sure her dad gets uh, killed in Ocarina of Time, and it doesn't seem like she has any siblings.
Oh, I meant child timeline. Like I thought Link had saved the king and whatnot.
Oh, sorry. No, you're totally right. I misunderstood what you were saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. Although, again, it doesn't seem like she has any siblings. So, unless her dad had another kid, it seems like it would pass to her.
Or
We know
maybe,
that.
well, it might pass to a cousin. It probably has an agnatico cognito, I think it is, inheritance, well, primogeniture inheritance. So it might
It,
pass to a cousin.
it could, but I guess maybe the different eras of Hyrule might have different styles of monarchy. But
Yeah.
we see the crown passed from the king to Zelda specifically in a couple of the other games. So
Yeah. It
that
was
would
Twilight
apply to.
Princess.
Yeah, and the king making in Breath of the Wild making reference to Zelda being a future ruler. So it would imply to me that in most cases, it does indeed pass from king to daughter if she's the only heir.
Yeah.
Um, so I would assume, unless she has a brother that we don't know about, it would indeed pass to her. But who knows?
Yeah. Oh, howdy, Formal Goose Foundation, one of my Twitch followers,
That's
because I'm
an
also
excellent
broadcasting.
avatar.
Oh, yeah. And we have someone I'm not familiar with, Corey. I like the fan theory that it's the princess that carries the line and heroes become kings or else political allies. Um, well, that's a that's an interesting view. I always took the view that no, the princess didn't always carry the line, only in some of the games, because I like the idea that this allowed her, in a way, a happier ending to an extent. But on the other hand, some of the games it's undeniable and it makes sense. I'm just looking at it from also a historian's point of view because um, my background is one of history, so women rarely ever inherited a crown in history. So I kind of made the assumption it's unlikely they would want to pass it down, as most families trace their lineage through the male line, and tracing yourself through the female is often difficult for kings and monarchs and whatnot of any sort. That said, in Japanese history, there were several times when they gladly went for the matrilineal line and there was no problems. So it can go either way here. But as to the heroes becoming kings, it might sound weird, but the only time I ever thought that that makes a lot of sense was Skyward Sword, where it's like, oh yeah, and even I guess Breath of the Wild, it's like, oh yeah. Well, I don't know Breath of the Wild if there's much of a kingdom to establish, but to an extent, you're going to have your work cut out for you. But for Skyward Sword, definitely, there's no way Link and Zelda didn't I guess, get together and you have king and queen, I guess, or else political allies. But like Ocarina of Time, for example, well, I guess maybe A Link to the Past it might make sense given the hero's journey. But as to Ocarina of Time, I got the impression that there's no way in heck it's happening due to different stations in life and that social divide. And your thoughts, Nayru?
I also think that in most cases, Link just has very little interest in being king.
Yeah,
Um,
there's that. But what about political ally or queen's consort?
oh yeah, absolutely. We see that quite specifically in Breath of the Wild, right, where he is
Mhm.
specifically assigned to be he is assigned to fulfill the royal position of the Queen's Knight, right? Not just as a protector in most senses, but in the political position of being an ambassador with her to other kingdoms and things like that. So we do see him fulfill a political role, and it would not surprise me if he fulfilled political roles in other timelines as well. But specifically for Ocarina of Time Link. He just kind of pisses off the moment the game is done in pretty much every timeline, right? So,
Yeah,
and in many cases, it does seem like the Link incarnations, when they finish one adventure, they just go off and find more trouble to get into, which you see with what you very much see with A Link to the Past, right? Where the moment that game's over, he goes off and saves two more kingdoms and then gets caught in Dreamland.
yeah, seems like the thing to do.
Yeah. So, yeah, definitely some incarnations of Link certainly did serve as political figures, which we've seen with our own eyes. And then
Yeah,
other Links, other ones like same with Wind Waker Link. When his adventure is done, he just goes off with Tetra to find some more adventure. So I think
yeah.
many of the Links have that cardinal desire for adventure that cannot be satiated with a life of politics.
They're they're rather like what Conan was at one point, Conan the Barbarian. But where Conan eventually chose to settle down and take a crown for himself, I don't think many links have that inclination. That said, um, as to if uh, the links get together with the Zeldas, I think that's part of this statement. Um, I would say, like I said, some of the games, it's yeah, like Skyward Sword. Um, but with a link to the past, not a link to the jeez, I'm always Freudian slipping out Link to the Past or Twilight Princess. But uh, with Ocarina of Time, that Link, like you said, just took off and rode off into the sunset with, where Majora's Mask is about to take place. And Zelda's pretty much left alone in Hyrule. And I didn't get much of the impression that when he did return to Hyrule, that there was that kind of romance between them. I don't know if it's just me. I just thought of them as just friends or something.
Yeah, well, it's kind of tricky, right? Because it could really go a couple of different ways. To me, there were some implied romantic vibes between Link and Zelda in the game itself, and
Fair.
I imagine those feelings would transfer because he keeps. I assume he keeps his memories, right? Because he remembers who Navi is
Yeah,
when he
he
goes
does.
back in time. So I would assume if he had a crush on Zelda, he would still have a crush when he was sent back in time. But when they are reunited, it does seem like they become very close, but it doesn't necessarily seem that they were intimate, or else why would he willingly leave her?
Yeah,
Um,
search for Navy.
yeah, exactly.
Who was his
And
real love? I'm kidding. I'm
there are
joking.
there are conflicting theories on what actually ended up with Link when he went back in time. Some people think that he ended up with Malon, and that they together sort of founded what would eventually become Ordon Village in Twilight
Mhm.
Princess. But then there are other people who think that he died alone, and the reason for that is because he becomes the hero's shade in Twilight Princess, and he talks about how he had no one to pass his skills along to. And if he had a wife, he probably would have had a son or a daughter that he could have passed his skills on to. So
He could have
why
died.
didn't he do that?
He could have died when his kids were still young.
That's true. Although the way it's framed is that he never really died. He just kind of uh, grew into undeath
Mm,
because the hero shade is a Stalfos.
mm.
Um, but it's all very weird with the hero's shade, anyways. So it's pretty. It's yeah. It doesn't seem like he ended up with Zelda in Ocarina of Time one way or another. To me, it seems quite likely it was either with Malon or nobody.
Okay. Um, I myself, I released a Malin video, but I didn't. I've never taken pairings in Legend of Zelda too seriously. I guess because I guess I just view it as if Nintendo doesn't confirm something, why think about it too much? Um, but then again, I also like the only time I kind of had the thought, oh yeah, there's something there was kind of with Midna, I guess, in Twilight Princess, and I and that was almost it. But even then, I was like, whatever. But with Malin, like I said, I ended up making a video about that pairing, and at first I did not take it too seriously because I was just doing it for fun. But I was very surprised and startled by the amount of enthusiasm people reacted to that video with. And part of my own defense of Zelda during this stream was also I noticed some people who didn't seem too taken with Zelda from Ocarina of Time, so I kind of wanted to defend the character, and I do want to make a separate video for Ocarina of Time at some point defending that interpretation of Zelda, just because uh, like I do think there is some valid criticism, but I also think that like I guess I'm middle of the road, and I'm like, yeah, well, like let's not be too harsh. With the knowledge she had, she did a lot of good, and she was operating in the narrative with as best knowledge as she had, especially in regards to what might happen by sending Link back in time. Because she was trying to be compassionate. It was just it blew up in everyone's faces, and but it's interesting because I think that there are some Links and Zeldas who I really like that they don't get happy endings, and there are others where you're happy that they do in a way. And I find that, like you've stated throughout the stream, Link's lack of happy ending in regards to the Hero of Time is very much an interesting aspect of his character. And it's interesting, I think, that Zelda doesn't really get a happy ending, at least I find probably in the child timeline, weirdly enough. And even in the adult timeline to an extent, there's not really much of a happy ending. And well, there might be a little, I guess, but like it's funny because I just find it interesting that no one really ends up happy in the end to an extent. Although the Malin thing, I guess, would mean that Link kind of had a bit of happiness, I suppose, at least for a brief time. There are things about that pairing that in that trajectory, I guess, I don't fully get. So, and I know I shouldn't say that as a YouTuber. Like, I'm not really the fount of wisdom like you are, Nayru, but there are things about that pairing and how that might have happened that I'm kind of still struggling to wrap my head around. Like the founding of Oron Village, okay, but on the other hand, you know what I mean? Like there's the whole hero's shade thing, like you pointed out, that I find, like there's kind of that hole and that Swiss cheese hole right there. Um, on the other hand, you know what? If Link ended up happy, it could be that like I don't know. There's a million theories you could come up with, but the trouble is, all we have are theories because Nintendo's never going to go back and answer these questions.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I think that the The Link and Malon pairing makes a lot of sense from like a character perspective. Link is a horse boy, Malon's a horse girl, so of
Yeah.
course they're going to be instantly attracted to each other. Um,
What
Malon is a rugged girl who likes a guy who's not gonna be afraid to get hard work, who is a better hard worker than Link.
she's
Um,
also she's also the um, she's also in line with a archetype like Korra, or the younger version of Persephone from mythology, or um, well, yeah, primarily it'd be Persephone, who's a fertility and spring goddess of Greek myths. So there is that element of the character as well that falls in. And then there's the whole theme with her mom. And with Epona was a horse goddess, but given that Epona is called by the mother's song, Malon's mom's song, I mean, what I always kind of wondered, given the pairing, um, is Epona supposed to be this? Is Epona supposed to, in a way, this might sound weird, like a reincarnation of the mother? Like, is she carrying the Malon's mother's spirit? A bit like Brother Bear with Sitka, the eldest brother, watching over his siblings as a hawk or an eagle of some sort. I don't know what you think of that line of thought.
uh, it could be. I would lean towards probably not, because like Epona abandons Malon pretty immediately, right? In
Yeah.
both of the timelines, and then goes over to watch over Link.
Well,
Um,
the way I looked at it was he's looking out for the one that she's looking out for the one that Malon wants her to look out for. That was one fear I kind of had, but I'm trying. I guess I'm just trying to look at it more thematically. But
to me, I think that Epona is sort of stands as a symbol of one of the things that would sort of bring the two of those people together, because when
horse
you
power.
first when yeah, the 4-H, when you first meet Malon, she is sort of the first kid, because you meet her before you meet Zelda, right?
Yeah,
And
in Little
she
Castle Town.
Yeah, exactly. And she's the first kid to unequivocally accept Link, like immediately, right? Like she meets Link and she says, "Hey,
Oh,
you're
very bold.
dressed kind of." Yeah, so she's like, "You're dressed kind of goofy. That's pretty cool. Let's be friends." Like there's no pretenses there. He doesn't have to work to earn her affection. She's just immediately like, "You're weird and I like that. Let's be friends." Even when he meets Zelda, she isn't immediately forthcoming with him. He sort of has to prove himself to her. Um, and sort of confirm that he's the man of the dreams she's been having.
Yeah,
Um, and then when you meet Epona, when you meet Malon later, when you go to Lon Lon Ranch, you meet her with Epona, and it's very much the case of where she's like. Epona is sort of like a part of her, right? Like Epona is almost like an extension of her personality,
yeah.
and so for Link to be able to draw Epona to her by playing the song so easily in a way that Ingo was not able to do later, even though I'm sure he would be able to learn the song if he wanted to. Um,
So the song you would say is one that only uh, Malin, her mother, and like kind of those directly connected to Malin in a way, like
exactly.
and to her love or her friendship in some way can perform.
Yeah, I think that she was just instantly drawn to Link in a way where she was willing to share that part of herself with him in a way she wasn't willing to do with other people in her life, like Ingo. And so for Link to play that song and then for Epona to immediately come to him, she even says that she's surprised that Epona has taken to him so quickly, right?
Mm.
And then when he rides Epona and she sees him treat Epona so well, and the two of them have that shared love of animals between them. Um,
Well, Link was raised in the woods, so he would have a familiarity and respect for nature.
Yeah, absolutely. So to me, it always made sense. Those two characters always felt like they were drawn to each other, um, just from the way that from the very get go, Malon accepts Link in a way no other kid does, and then Link in return exhibits traits that Malon clearly is quite fond of, and then when he comes back as an adult to sort of make references to the archetypes you were referencing. He quite literally, like one of the gossip stones, talks about how Malon is waiting for a knight to swoop her off her feet, and then Link, yeah, he quite literally comes into the ranch and saves them from Ingo's oppression, right?
And that would make Malon the lover archetype.
Yeah, there you go. So yeah, to me, it's always seemed like a pretty stable pairing between those two. I still personally lean a little bit more towards the idea of him being alone, just because that seems to work better with how he ends up in the hero's shade. But
Yeah.
I do quite like the pairing with him and Melon.
The interesting thing about Malon in Ocarina of Time, at least in the adult period, is that she's thrust into a similar role as Cinderella.
Yeah, I can see that.
You know, because her uncle basically enslaves her.
Yeah.
And Ingo obviously didn't learn anything from like his own hard times in life. Just like Madame Tremaine didn't learn anything from her own hardship and inflicted her rage and grief onto her stepdaughter, or in this case, Ingo's niece. But this is a pairing that I've made a video on, mostly from an archetypal point of view, but I still find, like, to an extent, this might sound like a weird question, but why this pairing? Like, why Malon? She's just a side character. Why do Zelda fans like her so much? Like, I'm not trying to bash the character. I actually thought she was a charming, funny little character. In the same way that, like, I guess you'd say Daphne from Scooby Doo might be a great character, like from the original cartoons. But why has she had like? Why have so many fans taken to her?
I think it's because with the 3D Zelda games, in every scenario, there are always multiple suitors for Link's affection, right? And just about I think the only game where there isn't is Skyward Sword. Even then, you have
Well, you have that bully character, that male bully character. What's his name? He's a suitor for affection.
That's
Okay.
true. Yeah, yeah. And you also have the lady in the market who's really mean to Link, but secretly she has a crush on him. I can't remember. I think it's Petunia or something like that. But in Skyward Sword, it's more or less just Zelda who's opining for his affection, and they're smitten from the get go, and they end the game even more smitten. But in every other Zelda game, Link is sort of a bit of an eligible bachelor, and he has multiple people vying for his affection. You know, in Ocarina of Time, you have Zelda, you have Malon, you have Saria, although that one gets weird real quick, and then you have Princess Ruto. And then in Wind Waker, you have Medley, and you have Princess Zelda, or you have Tetra. In Twilight Princess, you have Zelda, and you have Midna, which is like the big one that all the fans debate about, right? And I think the reason that people are so attached to and in Twilight Princess, you also have Ilia, who's kind of like Twilight Princess's Malon. And I think the reason that people are so attached to Malon is because they like the idea that Link and Zelda aren't destined to be together in every single timeline, because that makes the ones where they are quite obviously in love more special. Because if they were meant to be paired together in literally every single timeline ever, it would kind of make the romance feel a little bit more hollow, which is why I think it's really great that there are instances like Wind Waker where Tetra and Link are obviously very close, but they have a brother-sister relationship as opposed to anything romantic. And then you have games like Skyward Sword or Spirit Tracks where it is very blatant that these two characters are in love or are growing feelings for each other. And so the existence of Malon is, and also to a similar extent, somebody like Marin in Link's Awakening, they exist as proof that it's Link and Zelda are fated to be in each other's lives in every iteration, but they are not fated to be romantically involved every time. And Link is able to experience love with different characters. And I think the reason why fans take to Malon so much as opposed to someone like Princess Ruto is because Malon is sort of like it almost like a girl next door type figure, uh, where she's not quite the childhood best friend, because the
She's
childhood best
Betty
friend, yeah, the
from
childhood best
the
friend.
Archie comics.
What's that? Sorry.
Betty from the old Archie comics.
Oh, there you go. Um, yeah, she's not quite the childhood best friend, because the childhood best friend never ends up getting the guy, right? But she is like in all. She's like a homebody. She's like
Wait,
a.
there is one Dragon Ball. Chi Chi is the childhood female friend,
That's
and
true. Yeah.
I just remember.
Although I would say that Bulma is more of his childhood best friend, because they
Well,
only Chi Chi and Goku
mom,
only really
she
meet once
played
or
mom
twice.
to Goku,
That's true. Yeah, that's true. Her weird pervy mom.
who's more like Navy in a way,
Yeah.
bugging the crap out of him.
Um, but yeah, so Malon sort of serves as a crush, a girl next door type sort of figure, I think. Um, and her character just kind of meshes really well with Link's character for the reasons I said. They're both horse people. They both like the outdoors. They both have ties to nature. They're both orphans, and I guess she's not an orphan, but they both have lost parents. They both lost their mother. They've
Link
both had
was
to sort of come to take positions of responsibility, as Malon's father becomes like a useless bum pretty much immediately, and Link obviously has to protect everybody. So they have like an immense amount of things in common.
yeah, and just to add to that, there's also the fact that in terms of separation, Link might not have known well, he didn't know his biological mother, but in terms of maternal figures, he had to separate himself from Saria.
Yeah, and the Deku Tree as well.
Yeah, and there's Deku Tree, who was a fatherly figure, so he's basically an orphan as well, in a similar context, I guess, as Malon.
Yeah, he had to lose two sets of parents.
Oh, that must have sucked. Yeah,
Yeah, I would say so. But yeah, so that's why the pairing does really make sense to me.
I guess. Yeah, I don't mean that in a. I'm disagreeing. I'm just pondering it and going through it in my head. So yeah, um, I just like I said, I'm glad you're here to clarify it for me, because I posted a video some months ago and then got overwhelmed by the enthusiasm for the video, and I just threw this out there as a on a lark, I guess. Like, it's my first Zelda video. I'll just have fun here. Well, it's my first one since the cartoon reviews. I'll just have fun, whatever. I was kind of, I don't want to say mocking, but kind of poking fun at some of the pairing and shipping videos I've seen other Zelda tubers do. I threw it out there, and people just seem to really, I guess, take
Yeah,
to the
man,
pair.
the shipping community is intense.
Yeah, I didn't realize just how intense it was for Zelda. I thought after 25 years or so, it was pretty dead. But I guess not. So I wandered into that without fully realizing, like I'm in the Lost Woods. But as for, uh, here's one character I've not asked you about, and I think has kind of loomed over the whole thing with Pixie Wings and Pixie Dust. What of Navy? What are your thoughts on her?
I think Navi's great. I get really sort of unreasonably annoyed when I hear the critique about her being annoying or whatever. Because like every
No,
time I start a new playthrough of Ocarina of Time, I'm expecting to get annoyed by her, and then she bothers me maybe once every 10 minutes, and I'm like, what are people talking about? Where's this reputation coming from? I've never really understood it. I find her relationship with Link to be really um,
she's maternal.
yeah, she is. And one thing I've actually always really loved about Legend of Zelda, ever since they started having more in depth stories, is that they've always done such a great job of showing platonic friendships between men and women, particularly between Link and the many, many, many women in his life. Because there are a lot of female characters in Zelda.
He gets around.
Um, yeah, and I think Lincoln Navi is a really great portrayal of like a really deep, loving relationship between two people, but one
Yeah.
that's not romantic in any way. To the point where, like, when he goes back in time, all he cares about is finding Navi again, right? Even though Navi would have no idea who he is if he found her in this new timeline, that's still all he cares about is finding her and
Well,
rejuvenating that friendship.
she knows who he is because she accompanied him up to the cathedral, but or the Temple of Time. But on the other hand, she it's not the close knit relationship, like you said, that Link feels on his end with her. That said, like what what I also find really interesting is she seems almost reluctant to go on this journey with Link at the start and reluctant to be his fairy. But as the game progresses, she seems to take to the task with growing and increasing enthusiasm.
Yeah, and I think most good fantasy stories have that character, right? That sort of Han Solo figure who starts in opposition of the hero, but then very quickly warms to them and then becomes an indispensable ally.
Yeah.
And I think Navi fills that role pretty well. Um, and you sort of see a redux of it with Tattle and Tail in Majora's Mask.
I'm
Um,
just going to reference them.
Yeah, and I think maybe a more nuanced take of it as well in Majora's Mask. Um, but Navi is quite a good first attempt at that sort of character, and that's one they obviously revisit over and over and over again with Tattle and Tail, and then with Tetra, and then with Midna, and so on and so forth.
But it seems that Navi was probably the least icy of a lot of these type of characters.
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. She's only really hesitant. She doesn't even dislike Link in the same way that later
Midna.
characters do. Yeah, she just is unsure about him. Like, can Hyrule really put its future in the hands of such a lazy boy? Like you can't really blame her for being a little unsure about Link when the first thing she sees is him being a sleepyhead, right? Um,
Yeah, and she has to annoy him into wakefulness, and he's not exactly keen on getting up for the day. And
yeah, but then the moment he gets outside, he finds a sword, finds a shield, and then immediately goes and kills Goma. So he wins her favor pretty quickly.
yeah, and
Um,
but Navy herself is a bit of a successor character to what was her name? I think Pixie from the '80s cartoon. Now I know that was not with that was not with Aonuma and Miyamoto in them, but in a way, Navy's kind of a redux, but an updated, better version of that character. I don't know how familiar you
yeah,
are with '80s cartoon. I only watched some of it for the reviews,
I
and
watched through it once many years ago.
yeah, it's a funny series in a way. Like it's not my favorite thing, but I remember at one point teasing a few Zelda fans with, "Oh, this should definitely if all Zelda stuff is in the timeline, this one is in the timeline. This has to be in the timeline. It's definitely in the adult timeline." And it just annoyed the heck out of them. And I know I shouldn't troll people that way. It's just I'm more amused by the cartoon at this point as an adult than I am annoyed. And it had pretty good animation in hindsight,
Yeah, some of the stuff in the cartoon was actually not bad.
but it could have used a better nuanced story.
Yeah, that is very true.
Well, excuse me, princess. Oh, God. Link in there, like, that Link is nothing like the Ocarina of Time Link, who's clearly dedicated to his duties and devoted to his friends and his loved ones. So much so that in a Majora's Mask, as you mentioned, he goes off on the next quest to try and find Navi. And what I wonder is, I wonder if maybe, actually, in hindsight, maybe like if he did end up with Malon, did he did he maybe it's him coming back, but him going off to become the hero's shade, is it because he maybe tried to go continue his search for Navy? Was that why? Yep. Like, it's just a theory I'm throwing out there.
It could be like so. From what I understand about the hero shade, is that the reason that he became a Stalfos is because he had like an intense desire to be recognized by somebody and to pass on his skills. Um, which is interesting because it's almost not conceited, but like it's interesting for such a heroic character to care about having recognition, right?
Mm-hmm.
For a character who's otherwise pretty selfless to actually deeply care about being about having his deeds known is an interesting thing. I think there's an interesting theory about the whole Navi thing where once he finished Majora's Mask, he did indeed go continue to find Navi and got lost in the Lost Woods, and that's why he got turned into a Stalfos, which would make sense. But I don't personally like that feeling because or that theory because to me. Part of the theme of Majora's Mask is about moving on. Like
Yeah.
there's a whole thing about Skull Kid having to move on from his friends, the four giants. Right, he has to learn to let them go. And to me, it's all just like an overarching story about Link learning to let Navi go and learning to let his past life go. So I really hate the idea that the moment he finished Majora's Mask, he just continued looking for Navi. Um,
Mm.
so my hope is that that's not the case, but who knows?
Well, it just kind of fits in a way. I think, at least in that. But on the other hand, like, in regards to whose recognition did he want? Maybe Navy's, but
Well, the way it seems to be worded is like when he defeats Ganondorf in Ocarina of Time, he's the hero of time, right? He gets that title. Everybody knows what he did, and
yeah,
everybody across the world is thankful for what he did. The Goron know him by name to the point where the chief names his kid after him, right? The
but then he
Zora know his name. Yeah, and then he goes back in time, and nobody knows his name because all he does is, as a kid, tell the king to investigate this freaky looking Gerudo dude. And then the king goes and does it and foils Ganondorf before he ever gets to enact his plan. So he saves the kingdom, but in a much more minor way and doesn't gain this world recognition. But he still has the memories of having um, everybody in the world know what he did from the previous timeline. So he's existing in a world where no one knows his name, despite having existed in a world where everybody knows his name. So to me, it might not be Navi's approval he's specifically looking for. I think he's just wanting to be known for having gone through all the trials and tribulations that he did.
seems a little conceited.
That's the interesting thing, isn't it? Is that such a selfless character cares about something like notoriety. It's interesting to me, and it's. I think every good character has a character flaw, and it's tough to find one with the hero of time. And I think that's an interesting one that they present in Twilight Princess.
It would present him and Ganon as mirror images of each other in a way.
A little bit, yeah, for sure.
with Ganon being arrogant and wanting everyone to know that he needs to beat the hero of time. He needs to prove he's better than him. He needs to prove he's better than like the Link from Twilight Princess. While Link needs to prove to people that he was the hero. He needs people to know he was, so that there's a bit of ego there on both sides.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's a bit of a subdued ego with Link because in the end, all he needs is one person, right? All he needs is the hero of Twilight to learn his name and carry on his legacy, and then that's good enough for him to pass on. He doesn't need all of Hyrule to know his name. He just needs somebody to know his what he did and to pass on his knowledge to. But it is definitely interesting, just the fact that that desire was so intense that it kept him alive after death.
Mm. Right. And it also contrasts him with the other links in a way. Because you have, for example, Link to the Past, Link who just wants his uncle back. And I think he revives him with the Triforce, doesn't he?
Yep.
You have, sorry, it's been like 2 years since I played that game. So like a year and a half to 2 years. The memory plays it wasn't something I wanted to make sure I remembered because like if I don't commit something to memory, it doesn't always stick. Yeah. You've got, on the other hand, Skyward Sword Link, we know is a bit lazy by nature. And he takes things for granted too much when he shouldn't. You have Twilight Princess Link, who I'm not as familiar with his flaws there. You've got you have each of the links seemingly with his own kind of flaw, like at least a major one, which harkens back to traditional literature, where at least Greek classical literature, where each hero had a major flaw. Like you look at Achilles, who had his rage that turned him a little into the villain of the story, and you have Agamemnon, who had his greed, and gluttony, which made him want all of Anatolia, really, or at least Troy. You've got even the gods, like you have Zeus with his lust. You've got Ares with his bloodlust and his ego. Even Athena with her ego. So this kind of harkens back to that, I think. And Link having that kind of ego is something kind of classical in a way, at least from a literary point of view. And even the Arthuriana has the character, like each knight pretty much having a major flaw. And you have Gawain, who hungers for redemption in some stories because he accidentally killed an innocent woman because he was executing her husband, but she jumped in the way and he accidentally slew her. So he's hungering for redemption to atone for this great sin that isn't entirely his fault, but he imagined it to be. You have Percival, who's lusting and hungering for the Holy Grail and constantly chasing after it in some versions. You have Lancelot, who's just, I would argue, kind of the villainous knight, him and Mordred. And I know a lot of people like Lancelot, but every time I read like any kind of Arthuriana, Lancelot just seems like the villain. Like he's essentially Dark Link. And but yeah, so there's a reason why I compared Link, at least in all his incarnations in a way, to Gawain, the Maiden's Knight. That's Gawain's title. He's the Maiden's Knight, sworn to defend innocent children and maidens, and to never dishonor one because of his great sin. And except in a way, I guess the Hero of Time kind of has a similar failure in a way, and so has to. Except with him, it's the failure of not having been able to save Great Deku Tree, and so he's trying to atone for that in a way by, or at least trying to track down the evil wizard, so to speak, who cursed the Great Deku Tree and try to bring him to justice. But along the way there's all this tragedy and whatnot. So I guess there's a similar uh, uh, line from a philosophical point of view between him and Gauvin. Except Gauvin is often, I think, bedecked in red in some art rather than green. But just to be very interesting, uh, Gauvin ends up in one of his most uh, remarkable stories fighting against someone who's called the Green Knight.
Oh, that is pretty interesting.
So it, in a way, is yeah, yeah. Although the Green Knight isn't evil at all in the story, I think, from what I remember.
Well,
It's been a while, but
Legend of Zelda has always sort of struck me as a Japanese interpretation of European Western fantasy.
yeah, it
Um,
is.
so I think any of those connections could be valid.
Well, Link pulling the sword, the Master Sword from the stone, that that harkens directly back to King Arthur.
Very clearly, so yeah.
Yeah, and there's obviously an echo because Arthur is supposed to be blonde hair, blue eyed, pulling out the sword, and Link does the same thing. And um, though eventually the Excalibur sword breaks, and Arthur has to go to the Lady of the Lake. In
And
a way,
even if you look at the first couple Zelda games, uh, they had very strong, overt Christian theming. Like Link was a knight of God; he wasn't just a knight. And obviously, that's something they got rid of. Got rid of going into the third and fourth Zelda games. But like back then, Link had a cross on his shield, right? So I think
yeah.
the ties between Link and these godly European knights of fantasy were probably even stronger back then.
Well, arguably, maybe it became more of a subtle approach in recent years, in a way.
Yeah,
Like
yeah, I think that's
because
correct.
he's a knight, maybe not of God per se, or if there's a higher god above the three golden goddesses. In a way, I guess he would be a knight of that god, but he's technically, I would argue, maybe a knight of Furore. Because the Triforce of Courage and the Forest. At least Ocarina of Time Link is obviously supposed to, I think, be something like a knight of Furore with the woodland connection and whatnot. At least
Mhm.
that's how I probably read it. Same with Twilight Princess, because you have the animal connection and whatnot. But on the other hand, uh, in different games, Link has a different kind of connection to some of these golden goddesses. And in Skyward Sword, you have a direct connection to Hylia. So I guess he is, in a way, a knight sworn to God or goddess. But maybe that's also because knights are supposed to be sworn to God, sworn to uh, protect and safeguard the virtue of ladies, and sworn to their kings slash kingdom. So, in a way, I guess the oath to a goddess would be a double oath to a lady and God, so to speak.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's an interesting point for sure. And it's kind of interesting, especially because you think of the fact that Zelda is the reincarnation of Hylia, right? So
Yeah,
Zelda is both a maiden and a goddess. So when
yeah,
he is declaring his fealty to her, he is doing two in one for sure.
yeah, yeah, definitely. And like I said, I just think that with the Hero of Time, there's very strong connections to Ferrari.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
It's never. This might sound weird, but outside of I think Twilight Princess and Ocarina of Time are probably the two games where it's the most clear. There's such a strong connection to Ferrari, and maybe Breath of the Wild as well, because you're back to nature in a way. And I don't know. I think these games just there's a strong leaning towards Ferrari, whereas like with Wind Waker, I kind of had the impression more of Nayru in a way. There being a connection to Nayru to an extent. because I was kind of associated Nayru a bit more with water than, and I believe Nayru created the oceans, didn't she?
That would have actually been Pharaoh as well. So Din created the earth, Nehru created, or Pharaoh created everything biological, and then sorry, Din created the earth, Pharaoh created everything biological and of nature, and then Nehru created the laws of the universe, like time and space.
Okay, so I was mistaken. So Wind Waker has more of a strong connection to Hylia and Ferrari again.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah, sorry for that face plant there. Shows how
Oh, no
unfamiliar
worries.
with the law. And doubtlessly, there's a few people who are going to go after the stream. Unsubscribe. How could you be such a dumb moron? But um, but just before this, I had to do a Narnia and I was discussing a bit of Dragonlance with my brother. So some of the
Well, you're not
stuff bumped into each
you're
other.
you're not incorrect either, because the Zora swear fealty to Nayru, right? And they so
Yeah,
you'll often see Nayru imagery in the water temple. So there
that
is a connection there.
that might be why I kind of made that mistake, and kind of it got tangled up in my head.
Yeah,
That,
for sure.
but that said, like, uh, what I'd like to see is maybe a game where we maybe have uh, an expansion of sorts on Din, because in a way, because like I guess this is why I kind of like Tyrell Warriors. It's just you had Sia, who is redeemed by the end of the game and has a slightly closer connection to Din, and we got to see, I guess, to an extent, if a glimpse of what the Triforce of Power should be like. That it's not entirely just a force of evil, and that maybe Din's not pure evil, and that you have each of the golden goddesses, which are essentially good. It's just Gan's a shadow archetype and a manipulator archetype, to be honest, and he's perverted and misused his part of the Triforce, which was never supposed to be used that way to an extent.
Yeah, to me, the goddesses always seemed like they were meant to be malevolent, with a tinge towards good,
Oh, really?
where they're sort of more hands off.
Yeah.
Like
Well,
when they
that
were finally willing to intervene, it was in a very wrathful way, right? Like they were just
yeah,
wash our hands of everything and flood the entire world, kill everybody, kind of thing. Um,
yeah, harkening back to like the Greek flood myth or Noah myth and
yeah,
whatnot.
so it's like they will help humanity out when they need to, but it's going to be in a punishing way.
Yeah, uh, call upon them at your own peril.
It precisely, yeah.
But on the other hand, I kind of took the attitude they're distant, but they're not. They are wrathful at times, but not needlessly cruel to an extent. You know what I mean? Like they're not sadistic. And if to an
Yeah,
extent,
malevolent was the wrong word to use. I meant to say benevolent.
okay, well, they're benevolent but wrathful. But malevolent is a pretty good word to an extent. To an extent. And but I do think benevolent but wrathful probably describes them better. But that said, I do think that there's supposed to be a positive element to each of the three golden goddesses, especially when you look at power, wisdom, courage. And to an extent, my thinking about courage is it might mean more willpower, like the will, uh, the will to act, so to speak, as there seems to be a lot of connotations and ideas all wrapped up within the Triforce of Courage and whatnot, from what I can tell. And it seems like there's a lot of ideas with Link, at least from what I can recall of Ocarina of Time Link, Breath of the Wild Link, which are wrapped up in Howardian literature and whatnot. So, Howard being the writer of Conan the Barbarian. And then as for wisdom, we clearly get to see the positives with Zelda and whatnot. It's power, which, yes, power corrupts. Absolute power does corrupt absolutely in a lot of cases. But on the other hand, you get some pretty remarkable figures who are given absolute power, like Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius of ancient Roman history. You have figures like Charlemagne, Charles de Gaulle of more modern France. You have the Duke of Wellington to an extent, who had a great deal of influence and power, or at least a moment of power. And these men did not let it cloud their judgment or destroy them. So, well, I guess my argument is it'd be interesting to have a more positive figure of sorts to counterbalance Ganon to an extent. And I think Midna kind of fulfilled that role in Twilight Princess. And I think it's Miboru kind of fulfilled that in Ocarina of Time, like as the good Gerudo, counterbalancing Ganon. Or I should say Ganondorf. Sorry, I keep slipping up. To me, Ganondorf. Yeah, and I guess that's why I kind of like to see it, because I thought, well, by the end of the game, she's the positive to counterbalance Ganon's negative in a way. Like what Zelda would be like if Zelda had the Triforce of Power. I don't know what you think of this notion of it's Ganon who corrupted the Triforce of Power, rather than the Triforce of Power corrupting him, because Triforce of Power could be used for good. And what we forget is that, like, power, like, okay, well, when a woman conceives and gives birth to a child, that's a great deal of power. That's the power of creation, of beginning. And at least I guess I'm looking at it from that philosophical point of view. And so, like, Ganon's a clear negative with power.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything inherently evil or malicious about Din or the Triforce of Power. I just think that the trait of power itself tends to lend to corruption more than wisdom or courage does. So it's just sort of a natural byproduct that it's going to end up going to someone who may be evil. I think there is a very good chance that the Triforce could end, like the Triforce of Power, could end up on someone good's hand. We just wouldn't have a game then, so those time periods aren't as
interesting.
Aren't as worth talking about, because the main villain would just get annihilated by the guy with the Triforce of Power. I would love to see Link with the Triforce. I would love to see a game where all the Triforce positions get shifted around. Like I'd love to see a Link with the Triforce of Power, Zelda with courage and Ganon with wisdom, or switch Ganon and Zelda, whatever works. That would be really interesting.
Ganon, well, I was going to say, on the other hand, we could also equate maybe power with strength in a way. And, like, you know what I mean? Like, a kind of strength. But
yeah, it's tough, because I think strength can be found in courage or power.
That's fair. And if Link got the Triforce of Power, that'd be probably a more magically inclined Link.
Yeah, I would think. I think it would be more akin to like what we see in Fierce Deity Link.
Yeah, he'd probably be a real fearsome force of nature. That would be interesting. That would be interesting. I hadn't thought about it. Honestly, that thought never crossed my mind. So, yeah, and you have maybe Courage going to Zelda, which would be pretty cool. We might get to see a return of Sheik. But what I will say is, maybe to an extent, Zelda in Ocarina of Time exhibits great courage. Well, obviously, but maybe the trait that Ganondorf lacks in a way in Ocarina of Time is wisdom. What I mean is, he wants the Triforce of Power. He wants this divine power. Kind of like, well, I should have this power. I really want it. That he never stops to ask himself if he really deserves it in a way. You know what I mean? Like, it's greed that's motivating him for it. and arrogance, as you pointed out. So maybe it's a case where he has courage aplenty, he has a lot of power, but maybe he lacks the wisdom to understand why.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair because, like I said earlier, I think that Ocarina of Time is Ganondorf at his most intelligent, his most politically savvy. But I think there is a difference between wisdom and intelligence. D&D
Yeah.
got that one right, at least. Um, and I think his wisdom is lacking, which is easily proven in how, like we said earlier, he chooses to let Link survive time and time again because he's just so determined to win that final battle.
Well, there's two definitions to the Anglo-Saxon term for wisdom. There's the Old Norse meaning, which is to say to have a great collection of a great body of ancient knowledge, which Ganon has. But there's, or Ganondorf, I mean, but there's also the meaning, the modern meaning of thinking, like being able to see 5 steps ahead of you and having the ability to think with your heart and your brain and think with outside of your own point of view, which Ganon doesn't really have a lot of
Yeah,
ability for that.
he struggles very difficult. He struggles very hard with that for sure. It's the
Yeah.
foil to his plan again and again.
Yeah. But anyways, I think I've taken up enough of your time, and this has been a pretty invigorating, fun discussion. So, any other closing points you want to make about Ocarina of Time?
Yeah, I want to say that if anybody says that Ocarina of Time is overrated, which is a very common thing, right?
Really?
Especially nowadays
Yeah,
with
I've
newer
heard.
generations of gamers. They're being silly. It is not overrated. It is perfectly rated. Ocarina of Time reinvigorated the Zelda series. It established the format that the 3D series would follow going forward, and it revolutionized video games in more ways than we can count. So, Ocarina of Time deserves its place as one of the best games of all time.
Yeah. Well, I will admit this is not in my top like through like it might be not in my top 2 favorite Zelda games of all time, but after this discussion I can just say that it has a lot more nuance, depth, subtlety, and great I don't want to say pros, but it's far better than what even I realized in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
And
we've been talking for 2.5 hours, and I could easily talk about it for another 2.5. There's just so much to it.
yeah,
Like we didn't even really touch on how it's like a really incredible metaphor for growing up. Like the entire
yeah,
game is a really incredible metaphor for it. We
you never,
didn't touch on how incredible the environmental storytelling is in the game.
yeah,
We
or the
didn't
more,
the lore. We didn't even touch on any of the actual video, like revolutionary aspects it brought to video games, like the fact that Z targeting is still used in video game action games to this day, and was invented by
yep.
Legend of Zelda. So it is an incredible,
I could talk,
incredible game.
I could talk about the lore surrounding the Gerudo, the Zora, the Hylians, and even the Kokiri for hours.
We'll have to have another chat just about the Shadow Temple one day.
Yeah, that too. Like I said, though, I'd probably be most hyped for like any one of the races. I just love how like it's not the traditional fantasy races and whatnot and cultures.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to do this again sometime if you're ever up for it. But
Yeah, for sure.
anyways, uh, anyone watching this who's not yet subscribed over to Nayru YouTube, go do it. Great channel. Obviously, a great conversationalist. Far more knowledgeable about Zelda than I probably ever will be. So smash a like here and go subscribe over at his channel. And if you're coming over from him, I do hope you subscribe here because while I don't have as many Zelda videos, and this is more me exploring the Zelda mythology on my channel, I'm hoping to continue on doing that, and I do hope it entertains people. And you know what? This game truly is such a masterpiece, and I'm really glad we did actually sit down and discuss this.
Absolutely. I could talk about Ocarina of Time any day of the week.
Well, take care, everyone, and I guess everybody should remember to cling to their own Triforce of Courage.